continue with the same topic of common dilemmas in the neurosurgical practice. And today the focus is going to be on endoscopy. And we have two eminent personalities who are going to speak to us. One, Dr. Subodh Raju, will be talking on pediatric hydrocephalus, whether to select endoscopic third ventriculostomy or a ventricular peritoneal shunt. And another is Dr. Girish Datar from Miraj, who will be speaking on percutaneous and endoscopic procedures to the lumbar spine. Before we go for the introduction of the speakers, I would like to introduce our panelists today. Dr. T.M. Rao is a senior consultant neurosurgeon. He is at present working at Care Hospitals, Nampalli, and he has graduated from the Nizam's Institute of Medical Sciences and has more than 25 years of experience in neurosurgery. And his main interests are skull-base surgery and vascular neurosurgery. The other panelist will be Dr. Sukumar. He is also a senior consultant neurosurgeon, presently working at Yashoda Hospitals, Hyderabad. And he has carved a name for himself at the national and international level as far as percutaneous endoscopic procedures to the spine are concerned. Now we'll go on to the topics. The first topic is by Dr. Subodh Raju, and he'll be talking on pediatric hydrocephalus. To give an introduction to Dr. Subodh Raju, he actually did his MCH neurosurgery from the All India Institute of Medical Sciences in 2002, and at present is affiliated to the Institute of Neurosciences at Apollo Health City, Hyderabad, and also at Rainbow Children's Hospitals, Hyderabad. And his special interests are in hydrocephalus, pediatric neurosurgery, traumatic brain injury, neuroendoscopy, and minimally invasive spine surgeries. He has more than 27 various national and international contributions in journals. With this short introduction, I request Dr. Subodh Raju to please start this.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Hope I'm audible to all.
Yes, you are audible.
Yes, sir, you can go ahead.
Start sharing your screen.
Okay. 1 minute, I'll start sharing my slides first. Are you seeing the slides?
Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you, Ramakrishna, for organizing these webinars intermittently. It keeps us refreshed about different aspects of neurosurgery. And because we are not attending conference, CMEs and these things, this is a good method, and your initiative is wonderful. And my topic today is pediatric hydrocephalus, one of the most commonly dealt issues in this I'll be dealing with. Two examples of cases before I go into the actual topic. 8-month-old child presented with progressive increase in height size. You can see some hypodensity in the posterior fossa. It's a posterior fossa arachnoid cyst with hydrocephalus. So differential diagnosis is a communicating in hydrocephalus, infarct, arachnoid cyst, and requires further investigations. So it's as I told you, what are the management options? You do a craniotomy and cyst excision, ventricular peritoneal shunt, or cystoperitoneal shunt, or endoscopy. So with these things, this is a case of a recurrent hydrocephalus. Amount of exudates in the basal system, the tubercular meningitis, or a cases of ventriculitis. These are the different case scenarios I am showing you. What happens when these type of cases come to you in practice, and what do you do actually? What are the options available for you? My discussion topic will be along in these lines only, or a case who has already undergone a VP shunt, and you see a trapped fourth ventricle. So the use of endoscopy or a shunt will be based on these things. What do you do in these cases? This is another case of an hydrocephalus. This is a case of a multiseparated hydrocephalus. The different scenarios you see in day-to-day time. These are ventricular system, and for all the juniors, we have a functional classification of communicating versus a non-communicating hydrocephalus. Only one thing I want to tell you is non-communicating hydrocephalus, even the blockage at the fourth ventricle outlet is also a non-communicating. Otherwise, classical teaching was acute stenosis has to be a non-communicating, but we see number of cases of fourth ventricle outlet obstruction. That also becomes a non-communicating hydrocephalus. There is a contemporary definition. Different types of shunts are available in the market, and different companies are available. Till then, for a general neurosurgeon practicing neurosurgery, what is a standard treatment? If someone asks, where do they fall back upon if you can't do anything? It's a shunt only. I'll not say it's a gold standard, but it is the fall guy you can tell. Where nothing works, you have to put in a shunt actually. But it has its own limitations, as everyone knows. It has a failure rate of as high as 40% in the first 2 years and 100% in its lifetime, and requires consistent revision based on varying flow rates. And it is unpredictable and difficult to survey the changing conditions. You have these situations where there is an slit ventricles because of the over drainage, or you can have subdural collections where you are using a fixed pressure shunts. You are not using a programmable shunts actually. In these cases, you have it. Then we have the different complications of shunts, starting from going into the inguinal causing hernia, the length of the shunt getting short, you have to lengthen it, obstruction at the peritoneal end, perforation of the gut with the shunt leading to peritonitis, hydrocele. Acute CSF ascites is seen in cases of inflammatory conditions where you have put in an early shunt without treating it. It can lead to a peritonitis and localized CSF collection in pockets, or it can lead to a complete ascites where you have to do other options of CSF diversion. Then these types of case reports are available of shunt migrating into different areas. And so here comes the role of neuroendoscopy. So these are the different indications where you can use a neuroendoscopy, and with people using it more and more. So their expertise has increased and the indications have gradually increased, starting from the most commonest indication what everyone uses, a primary acute stenosis. But you have posterior third ventricular tumor, obstruction of the Luschka and Magendie, a posterior fossa SOL, repeated shunt infections, and the isolated or the trapped ventricles. So as you know, the highest success rate of 75%, more than 75% seen in acquired acute stenosis or a tumor obstructing the CSF flow. Then as the different indication comes, the success rate decreases gradually. This is talking of pediatric patients actually. Then one more very important indication is subjective, wherein a surgeon feels that they prefer to use this method even if the success rate is low. In a case if the success rate of ETV is low, 50% also, the surgeon prefers to use it. The judgment here is that at least in those cases, the child will not require a shunt. And if it fails, we counsel the patients, yes, if it fails, be prepared for a BP shunt. Tools of the endoscopes are available, different types of endoscopes are available, the pre-op and post-op, some of these cases. Complications are there. We should not think that the shunt doesn't have complications, starting from intraoperative to bleeding, injury to the fornices, bradycardia, and post-operative you can have subdural effusions, you can have pneumocephalus, and in late you can have seizures and these things. What is a measurable outcome what is the literature tell? When do you tell that the shunt is functioning or it's a successful endoscopic third ventriculostomy? Successful endoscopic third ventriculostomy is considered when there is shunt independence, there is a change in ventricular dimensions, ventricular size, and the stoma is patent. Most important people neglect is the developmental outcome also has to be considered. So that also has to be taken into account when you're looking at measurable outcomes. There's a child, actually I did a ETV 12 years back. You can see this. Somebody would have seen this and told that why do you have to operate this child? Child had a large head with these things. And you believe me that the child has come back to me, a follow-up after 12 years, absolutely normal development. He's studying in class, I think slightly class 6 or something, 5 or 6, doing well in school. So I thought that yes, I mean, I operated at the age of around 6 months, 4 or 5 months when this first scan was operated. And this is now 12 years. I just out of academic interest, I asked them to get an MRI done. So there are long-term results which make it good. Here, taking a pause, we would like to review a very important paper published by Abhay Kulkarni. Shit. Where did it go? Sorry. One minute. It went off. Uh, 1 minute. It went out of the screen. Give me a second. Am I?
Yeah, we are able.
You're able to see. Okay. So here comes a very important paper by Abhay Kulkarni. The slide is not moving.
You have to click on the slide and then move it. I think that will. Yeah. Now you.
It's got stuck actually. Yeah. Where they have done, they have tried to find out because they try to find out a predictive model to know whether this endoscopic thyrventriculostomy will be successful or not. So they took a number of patients' data. Prospectively, the study was done, and using a multivariate logistic regression, they found out these things. They have taken age, etiology, and previous shunt as a criteria. They gave basis score. So if you add the age score, etiology score, and the previous shunt score, that tells the percentage probability of ETV success. Suppose the child is more than 50 years, acute stenosis, no previous shunt. So it comes to the success of this procedure is around 90%. Where the child is less than 1 month, it's post-infectious, and the child had a previous shunt, 0 to 10% is the success rate of the procedure. It helps us in basically the use of this thing is best helps us in counseling the patients in the OPD actually.
Subodh, your screen has got stuck. Subodh?
Yes, sir.
Subodh, you have to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
I can hear you.
Actually, the power went off for a minute actually. So,
Yeah, please carry on, sir. Please carry on.
are you able to see my screen now?
Yes, sir.
No, not yet. We are able to see you. You have to start sharing. Yes, we are able to see your screen. Right.
Yeah.
We are able to see.
The different series are available about the. Are you able to see me now?
Yeah.
Yes, we are able to see you.
Yeah, different series are available about the outcomes in these subset of patients actually. So infants actually have a poorer prognosis than outcome regarding the success of endoscopic thyrventriculostomy. And when you look at the long-term outcomes, reliability of ETV after 1 year of age is stratified according to age. So if you have done the ETV at 0 to 1 month of age, the success rate is 31%. But if you have done it above 2 years of age, the success rate is 84% actually. Shunt versus ETV, 5-year outcome. The International Infantile Hydrocephalus study, everyone is aware of this. Here they found out that treatment type did not impact the 5-year outcome for children with acute stenosis and hydrocephalus. So here, either you do a shunt or an ETV, the outcomes are almost equivalent. It is helpful for counseling the parents actually, what you want to do actually in these patients. This is another endoscopic third ventriculostomy and VP shunt with non-communicating. It's a complete meta-analysis. They have come out in support of ETB, telling that the complications, the reoperation, and the hospital stay and these things were better. The most common indication, as I told you, is the acute stenosis, where we see it could be a primary acute stenosis or because of an hemorrhage or post-meningitic. And the basic operative technique, I did not tell anyone because everyone is familiar with it. So there's another interesting instance of a patient having a choroid plexus hyperplasia with high output hydrocephalus. Here we have done a VP shunt. Patient used to develop huge amount of ascites because the outflow was very high. In this condition, we did a laser coagulation and laser coagulation of the choroid plexus, and I mean, it's more than 6 months, 8 months now. The child is doing well actually. We use the thulium laser. So these are the indications where the endoscopy is very, very useful actually. This one we had done a shunt, we waited, the child developed ascites. First we did a routine coagulation with bipolar. Then we have to do an extensive bilateral fulguration of the choroid plexus. Then only things did well. The patient did well. You can do it. Other indications of doing an endoscopy with hydrocephalus is large arachnoid cyst, suprasellar arachnoid cyst with hydrocephalus. Excellent case for doing a neuroendoscopy. The parietal different areas. You can get arachnoid cyst with hydrocephalus at different locations. And for this, I still consider endoscopy to the gold standard actually. And posterior third ventricular lesion presenting with tumor with hydrocephalus, a pineal or a tectal region tumor. You can do an endoscopic biopsy along with the videos. The videos are, I don't know why it's stuck. Yesterday it was playing. So it's telling media not available. I'll go to some other videos. Idiopathic stenosis of the foramen Lashka and Magendie. Less described, but these are the causes of a fourth ventricular outlet obstruction. As I said, here comes the role of a flexible endoscope. I mean, telling you should have numerous adjuncts to the rigid endoscope when you're treating hydrocephalus. The flexible endoscope is a very good adjunct for this reason. And you can see here, you can pass it through the lateral ventricle, through the foramen of Monro, through the aqueduct into the fourth ventricle. This is a demonstration just to show how this is aqueduct. You can see here, and just to know the anatomy of the fourth ventricle. There is a choroid plexus, the large foramen of Magendie here open, the skull occipital bone. You can see through it. You can see the occipital bone here. The choroid plexus. These are the foramen of Lashka. You see the choroid plexus going out. So in these cases, a flexible endoscope is very, very useful. And you can do a complete inspection and understand the anatomy of the fourth ventricle. These are the colliculus, superior and the inferior colliculi. This one, yeah, you can see here, yeah. Fourth ventricular outlet obstruction, you can do a foramen of magendostomy. Then a large, as I showed the first video here, first image, there's a large posterior fossa arachnoid cyst causing a fourth ventricular outlet obstruction, causing hydrocephalus. here after doing, because it's an obstructive hydrocephalus, you do a standard third ventriculostomy. Along with that, you have to take care of the arachnoid cyst. So this is the aqueduct. You go through the aqueduct. The arachnoid cyst is bulging into the fourth ventricle. You can do marsupialization and your job is done. So very, very important aspects. So when we talk of VP shunt versus endoscopy, I don't think it's correctly placed actually. I feel that endoscopy is a very, very useful tool in our armamentarium to take care of these things. This is again a large posterior fossa arachnoid cyst where you have done a transaqueductal transmesenteric cyst decompression. You can see this is the aqueduct and there's a large retrocerebellar cyst here, which is pushing the cerebellum inside. We'll try to locate the foramen of Magendie and then go through the foramen of Magendie and try to decompress this. This is the foramen Magendie. We are using a 2 French Fogarty catheter to just to make way for the cyst. Here, otherwise, you would have to do double shunt in the supratentorial ventricular system and another shunt in the posterior fossa arachnoid cyst. Or you do a large suboccipital craniotomy and decompress this cyst. I'm not getting the forwarding button. You can see we are just seeing the choroid plexus in the. You have to go through that. We are passing the endoscope slowly. After we made a space, then we are slowly passing the endoscope into the through the foramen of Magendie. You can just see the arachnoid cyst seen here. This is the arachnoid cyst seen here. So once you see it, you make a number of fenestrations all along, and you basically marsupialize the arachnoid cyst. Along with that, you have done a third ventriculostomy also. So both the things are taken care of actually in these cases. A very useful procedure with the new chip and tape flexible endoscope. The patient had some subdural hygroma in the initial period, but that also settled down with time actually. This is another case where we have placed a retrocerebellar arachnoid cyst which had a very, very narrow prepontine cistern. So we placed a catheter into the fourth ventricle through the aqueduct and into the cyst actually. We placed a shunt catheter and connected to a routine VP shunt actually. This is the aqueduct you can see here. The cistern, prepontine cistern is very narrow to do any third ventriculostomy in this case. This is aqueduct. Similar way, you have to make small space first and then guide the catheter inside. The arachnoid cyst here. Here also we coagulate and marsupialize the arachnoid cyst. The cyst you can see here. The cyst wall. You can do a number of fenestrations into that. We have a flexible monopolar cautery. Make number of openings there. Be careful, the pica vessels will be there. So you have to be very careful in these cases. And after that, you place a shunt inside it and your job is done. A single shunt taking care of both the posterior fossa and these things. We could not do a third ventriculostomy. The other indications, this is a trapped fourth ventricle where you have used a flexible endoscope to place a catheter inside. You can see the catheter inside here, inside the fourth ventricle. And again, similar way connected. Posterior fossa tumors, you can use it. Post-traumatic hydrocephalus, there is no current indication. There is a contraindication, but yes, the success rate is limited in these cases. As I told you, uncommon indications are isolated lateral ventricle hydrocephalus, Dandy Walker, or these are cases of trapped ventricles actually. Trapped ventricle with hydrocephalus. This is also very good indication for doing there's a trapped ventricle with a completely blocked foramen of Monro. So here, simple septostomy takes care of the things actually. If required, do a shunt. Intraventricular hemorrhage with hydrocephalus, you can use it. And there's a I'll not go into the detail of intraventricular hemorrhage, but we see in the neonatal period how to take care of this these type of hydrocephalus and what to do, because intraventricular hemorrhage is a very in our pediatric practice, the hemorrhagic disease of newborn, especially the grade 1, grade 2, we see drain and day out. The another challenging thing which we see in our day-to-day practice is ventriculitis, post-infectious ventriculitis. These children can run with you for years or months together. They will be with you actually. You do repeated ventricular wash, paste a catheter till the CSF becomes sterile, or you go for a ventricular subgaleal shunt in these cases. You can see how the inside looks. Okay. Thick coating of exudates inside the ventricle. This is how they look like. So irrigation helps in reducing the load of the infection and preventing adhesions. So these children, we regularly do endoscopy, at least if it is not subsiding, once in a month, and put a reservoir in along with its ventricular subgaleal shunt. If it is responding, it's well and good. If it doesn't respond, then we go for repeated thing. The most important thing, it helps us in preventing adhesion and leading to multiseptate hydrocephalus in these cases. This is a flow of what we do in cases of ventriculitis actually. Out of the purview, but because it's an hydrocephalus, it's a very challenging aspect of hydrocephalus, this ventriculitis. That's why I thought that I should include part of infection into it also. This is the thing, we do a contrast imaging. If there is enhancement, debris or exudates, we do a ventricular tap and isolate the organism, start on IV antibiotics. If there is a hydrocephalus still increasing, we put in a VSG shunt or do an endoscopic lavage and a reservoir placement. The child continues to receive IV and intraventricular antibiotics. Idealizing of the CSF parameters and 3 consecutive cultures sterile, then we go for a CSF diversion procedure. That's usually we use, because the systems are very bad, so we do a VP shunt in these cases. And if it had already caused a multiseptate hydrocephalus, we do septostomy along with a CSF diversion procedure. But if the infection continues, we do a redo lavage and we do a change of reservoir. Multiseptate hydrocephalus, as I told you, is a dynamic thing. It's not a static thing, because today you shunt 2 compartments and do septostomy. After 3 months, they will be coming with another thing. In these cases, navigation is very helpful. We use neuronavigation or an ultrasound guided ultrasound. If the frontal is wide open, ultrasound guided navigation to take care of and placement of the shunts actually in these cases. This use just you see navigation and endoscopy is being used to perforate the septum at different places. What happens is all the septums which are there in the midline and other things, even if the CSF drainage, if the CSF drainage is not massive, they will not have a lot of shift actually. But you have to be careful not to allow too much CSF to come out, or you should be careful that you should not infuse too much CSF to cause a massive shift. But because they are inflammatory, they sometimes have a fibrosis in that actually, and they'll be stiff actually, and you don't have to worry about that. But if you are suspecting a shift or anything, please use an ultrasound in these cases. This child, which we did first, they presented again. We had put the shunt here. After 3 months, this child presented with another 3 of these separate septations. So again, 1 round of septostomy. Here we go from exactly the opposite side, endoscopy, and try to trace the shunt here. So you are doing an endoscopy navigation guided and trying to identify the shunt. So in the process, what you are doing is you are basically fenestrating number of septae actually on the way. Communicating hydrocephalus, it can be used. Coming to the main contraindication, it's not an absolute contraindication, but we will consider it as the relative history of radiotherapy, significantly distorted anatomy. If you don't have any navigation system or anything, or an ultrasound, don't you do that. And an abnormally very narrow prepontine cistern is also in relative contraindication. An infection, of course. So these are cases of difficult third ventricular floor, inflammation, tremendous exudates, a narrow prepontine cistern, and here even after opening number of places, you still could not find the prepontine cistern actually. So in these patients, what do you do? So these are cases where you want to do, a child has undergone already a shunt failures. So we do something called a translaminar terminus third ventriculostomy, and the laminar terminus everyone is aware of. They open it during an anterocommunicating artery aneurysm or when you do a supratentorial surgery to take care of the hydrocephalus. So instead of opening from the top, we can do and pass a flexible endoscopy and open it through inside. And this is the anterocerebral artery complex. There's a laminar terminalis here. Make an opening, dilate it, and you can see the anterocerebral artery complex there. Let me see this video, please. Yeah. So we did it, but it was highly vascular, thick exudates were there in the floor. We were not sure whether this thing will work. The acute is stenosis, so we went to the laminar terminalis. There is a low current monopolar to make an initial opening there. Otherwise, it's very slippery area. That area, because of the angle there, it is anteriorly placed. So the angle is such that you don't have a direct pressure on that with a rigid endoscope. So we use a flexible endoscope to that. Opening up, you can see the intrahemispheric cisterns here. Then pass a 2 French Fogarty catheter to dilate it. Flexible endoscope. This is optic chiasma. This is optic chiasma. So open it, and this is optic chiasma here. Above that is the anterior superior to that is the laminar terminus. This is the intrahemispheric fissure here. So this is a paper published, original article we published about a feasible alternative to standard third ventriculostomy. So concluding, hydrocephalus is one of the major health burden. Neuroendoscopy is a very attractive thing. Less complications, avoid shunt revisions, but always remember, if you don't have anything, the only thing to fall back to on is a VP shunt only. And I will touch the very important aspect of endoscopy is neurodevelopmental outcome in children with hydrocephalus. When we think that the surgery has been successful, but what happens to the development of these children? For us as a neurosurgeon, if the child doesn't require a VP shunt, then the surgery has been successful. So, but we have a subset of children who, in spite of having a successful surgery, may not have a normal neurodevelopmental outcome. So head circumference and the time of presentation is very, very important in these cases. And more than 54% of the children with head circumference of more than 95 centile had a bad outcome. So we have to follow this up and regularly treat them also, get them to a rehabilitation center, to the neurologist, and so that they do well. Some amount of rehabilitation is done for them during down the line also. So as I told, developmental outcome depends on number of factors, including the etiology, and the outcome is independent of the whether you have done a VP shunt or ATV. Always remember that. So whenever somebody tells, a patient comes and tells us, "Sir, we don't want a shunt, please do an ETV." Always tell them that taking care of hydrocephalus is more important than the procedure. A procedure we may do anything, but the hydrocephalus has to be taken care of. So in those cases where I'm convinced that the shunt has to be done, but the patients nowadays, they go into Google and see that shunt has so many complications, I tell them. So taking care of hydrocephalus is very important in this stage. And if down the line a shunt fails or something, then we can always try an ETV because the age will be better and the brain parenchyma would have matured better to take care of these things. So it's the major challenges which you face in our practice is hydrocephalus in premature and low birth weight. As low as 1.2, 1.3 kg children also we have operated. Post-infective hydrocephalus. And as I told, cognitive and neurodevelopmental outcomes. But luckily, infants have some plasticity and elasticity, and rapid and aggressive treatment has to be initiated, and irreversible damage to the growing brain has to be avoided. Thank you very much. Sorry for the interruption in between because of the power failure, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Subodh. That was an excellent presentation. I should really congratulate you on the quality of the videos and the work which you have been doing. So now we'll go on to the second talk. This is by Dr. Girish Datta. He has got a very impressive CV. He is a minimally invasive and endoscopic spine specialist. He is practicing at Miraj, and he is a fellow of endoscopic spine surgery, fellow of interventional spine pain management. He is the director of International Intradiscal Transforaminal Spine Society, and he is on the editorial board of multiple journals. And he is listed and featured in Forbes magazine as Leaders in Healthcare 2020. And his academic and work experiences, he has an experience with more than 2,000 endoscopic spine surgeries, transforaminal and interlaminar, 800 endoscopic decompression of stenosis, more than 1,000 rhizotomies and intradiscal procedures. He's got more than 15 international and national publications to his credit. And he has got more than 130 international and national presentations as faculty, and the list is actually endless. But I think all of you are want to listen to his talk. I present Dr. Girish. Dr. Girish, can you please come online?
Good evening, everybody. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to speak in this forum. Is my presentation screen visible, and am I audible?
Yes. You are very clear, audible, and your screen is also clear.
Okay. Yeah. First and foremost thing, I would like to thank the organizers of this webinar for giving me this opportunity. And I've been given with the task of speaking about endoscopic spine surgery in the lumbar spine. Well, with the amount of time that we have, I thought I would rather touch upon the various kinds of endoscopies that are done in the lumbar spine. Though endoscopy is now also being done in cervical spine and in thoracic spine, but I'll be confining myself only to the lumbar spine. So it all started in the 1800 when we started doing larger surgeries. And it was always thought that, bigger surgeons make big incisions. And for a simple disc herniation, we did a surgery called laminectomy. Over a period of time that we understood the pathology and the pathophysiology of the whole problem in a better way, we restricted ourselves to more smaller incision and taking off less amount of bone, preserving more that is possible. So we have metamorphosed from a large surgery to smaller and smaller as we go by. Then came a huge era of microdiscectomy, which was by and large the gold standard. And we did most of our surgeries using microscopes or using the loops, and did a pretty good job by that. So all these surgeries have stood a test of time for more than 1 century. So there is no way we can criticize these surgeries, but minimalism is the rule of the game today. So as we progress ahead in the 21st century, we are looking with better opportunities, better options for our patients so that we create as less collateral damage as possible. Then came in tube systems which were endoscopic assisted, and were very wrongly in the society called as endoscopic spine surgeries, because these are not true endoscopies, because you don't operate through the working channel of the endoscopes, whereas you use the endoscope only for visual available in the market, and even these have proved successful in managing most of the problems. Then started this new era wherein from Pervez Cambin, Hijikata to what we do as endoscopy. So various kinds of transforaminal surgeries, the concept of foraminoplasty, and the concept of management of stenosis with an endoscope. So what are the basic problems that it made us to change from what we were doing with the microdiscectomy or endoscopic assisted system? Was the patient factors were larger incisions, good amount of blood losses, high chances of infection because of larger incisions, post-operative scarring because of too much of dissection, which usually translated to a longer hospital stay, prolonged debility, and in some patients cause secondary instability, not in everybody, but in some patients cause instabilities, chronic pain syndromes, and made the whole job with re-surgeries difficult, because recurrent herniation is probably not the problem of the surgery, but it's the problem of the patient, it's problem of the pathology. So you have the disc or the intervertebral end plates throwing out more loose fragments inside, which eventually come out as herniations. Now, as far as the surgeon factors were concerned, there was absolute poor visualization because of the pooling of the blood, even though you have a good suction and other things. Longer surgical times were required in especially very large patients or obese patients. Resurgeries became technically extremely challenging because to get into that vascular structure and to take off the adhesions, whatever had caused because of the previous surgery, made job little more easier. Foraminal and extraforaminal herniations, we had to have a completely different approach for these herniations so that we could reach the target area. And sometimes in a quench to take off the herniation or do a lot of things, we created iatrogenic instabilities. So the reason to change was minimum to no innocent bystanders. That is that you create no injury to the innocent bystanders like the paraspinal musculature and the lamina per se. Visualize the intradiscal pathoanatomy. Now, over a period of time, it has been stressed and overstressed, and pathophysiology has clearly explained that the whole problem of the disc herniation starts from the end plate. So it's all intradiscal. So it's sometimes justified to go in, not always, but in sometimes it is justified to go in the disc and to see what kind of a problem is there. And there are some problems which are very, very specific to the annulus and the intradiscal area, which need treatments. Limited to no removal of lamina because this is an innocent bystanders for the problem of disc herniation. Minimum to no opening of the ligamentum flavum, especially for disc herniations. For stenosis, yes, this is part of the pathology, so it needs to be dealt with. But for disc herniations, you need not do it. Operate under awake and aware state. So this was a fantastic thing that happened with transforaminal surgery, that we could operate these patients in under awake and aware state, that is under local anesthesia, which ensured adequate neuromonitoring because patient himself is a good monitoring device. Now, a good ventral decompression. Anytime we do a posterior decompression surgery, we have to retract the whole neurological structures to gain access to the ventroepidural space, which made it a little more difficult because you have something beyond the midline, then you have to come from the opposite side. So in transforaminal surgery, by and large, you are into the ventroepidural space. So achieving a ventral decompression became the hidden zone of McNabb, which was a hidden zone for the open posterior surgeons, became no more a hidden zone. But this is the area where we completely land inside. So gaining an access to this area is all important. So access to all zones of spinal canal, part of the spinal canal, not the whole thing, foramen and the extraforaminal part became pretty easy with the transforaminal surgery. Now, as far as this endoscopic surgical armamentarium of endoscopy is concerned for disc herniations, for stenosis, and now over a period of time, we've already been doing fusions. So it's been about 2.5 years that we have already been doing fusions now. So what kind of an access we have for various kinds of problems? For disc herniation, we have a classical posterior lateral approach that you directly get inside the disc, do your job in the disc, then come out and do the thing. Then you have an access through the superior articular process. By me saying superior articular process, it is the non-articular part of superior articular process. And by and large, you have the far lateral approach where you can have a completely ventroepidural access without getting in the disc at all. You can have an extraforaminal approach wherein foraminal and extraforaminal area, to explore this area became quite easy. We have the interlaminar approach for disc herniations, and then we have over the top contralateral for bilateral large central herniations in case you want to take it off. So you can do a job through the same access system. For stenosis, you have the classical interlaminar system. So you do a classical ipsilateral decompression with the interlaminar endoscopy. You can do an over the top and under the top endoscopic decompression on the contralateral side, and a foraminoplastic decompression of the foramen and the lateral recess through the transforaminal route. And with the para-PSLD, we can do a decompression again of the foramen and the extraforaminal part by a paraspinal approach with an posterior endoscopy. For fusion, as per the conventional thing that we do is a posterior lumbar interbody fusion, which can be again performed with a endoscope for the posterior axis. This has made it more possible now because of the expandable cages which are now available. So even with a smaller access system, we can get inside the interbody area. Now, the best part about endoscopic system for fusion is that you are able to prepare the end plates pretty well. So that ensures that you have good raw bone there, which will help you. You can also pack in a good amount of bone graft. So that accentuates the fusion process in the whole procedure. So the second axis is through the transforaminal route, which is very similar to that of the TLIF. So which is a foraminoplastic transforaminal axis. And now the latest one which is coming is the endoscopic assisted oblique lumbar interbody fusions. Now we'll see a little bit of each of them. So before that, we'll go into the technology. So we usually have a rigid endoscope, which are of different sizes. The transforaminal route accommodates an endoscope or a sleeve size not more than 8 millimeters. So you have an endoscope with a working channel of maximum 4.3. You can have 3.7 and smaller ones if you need to get inside the disc so that you reduce the amount of injury to the disc as well as to the annulus. But by and large, all these working channel endoscopes have irrigation ports so that a continuous saline irrigation is there. Then you have the light source and the camera, a full HD camera. The most useful instrument in endoscopy today is the radio frequency. Now, the advantage of having this kind of a radio frequency, which is primarily what we are looking at, is about a 4 megahertz radio frequency, because this radio frequency does good amount of ablation as well as coagulation. At the same time, does not dissipate collateral heat. Now, this is important because we are working very close to the neurological structures and very close to the dorsal root ganglia, which can have a lot of issues with the heat transfer. So this flexible probe, which is there, can be bent so it can reach all nook and corners when you're doing your endoscopy. So this is primarily operated in two different modes. One mode is a coagulation mode and second is an ablation mode. Various other tools which would be required for transforaminal surgeries are different kind of sleeves, profines, then you have Kerrison rounders and various kinds of rounders like tooth rounders or cup rounders, cutters, scissors, everything. Other most important thing is when you have a narrow foramen in a degenerated spine and you want to create a space because you don't want to jam in your 8 millimeter cannula inside the foramen when it is already narrow. So you need to create more room in the foramen first. So for that, you may have to first proceed with a thing called as a primary foraminotomy. So you may have to do a part of the removal of the non-articular part of the superior articular process to make more room in the foramen. And once you create more room in the foramen, it would be easy to go inside and sculpt bone and take off soft tissue, whatever is required to decompress the neurological structures. You have various other energy tools like the colleague of mine, they use lasers now for everything. So there are two basic kind of lasers. One is a holmium laser and second is a thulium laser. The thulium laser is a continuous waveform, so builds up a lot of heat when we are operating. So not usually recommended for endoscopic surgery. For endoscopic surgery, it is the holmium YAG laser, which is a pulsed laser. And this pulsed laser helps in dissipating heat so that you don't create collateral thermal injury to the neurological structures. We have a couple of routes. So this kind of an entry is the posterior lateral entry, which is a classical yes technique that we do. Second is a far lateral entry, which was explained by some of the European surgeons like Dr. Rutten, wherein you go far more laterally and gain access directly into the epidural space. Third entry is a more steeper entry for foraminal and extraforaminal herniations, where you can deal with the extraforaminal part much more comfortably. And the fourth is a foraminoplastic ventral epidural access, wherein you do a foraminotomy to gain access into the ventral epidural space. So the advantages of a transforaminal access or a transforaminal surgery would be, these can be performed very conveniently under local anesthesia. It's very good for patients who are old, infirm, and patients with comorbid conditions. Ideal for upper lumbar herniations where you really do not want to retract the neurological structures. You can address concomitant unilateral lateral stenosis, lateral recess stenosis by taking off more bone in the lateral recess. Address far and near migrations both. So superiorly migrated as well as inferiorly migrated herniations can be comfortably taken off. Intradiscal visualization and if any kind of a treatment is required, like thermal annuloplasty or something like that, can be performed conveniently. Preferred for post-surgical residual pain if you have a reherniation after a posterior surgery. This would be a virgin area to get inside and take off rather than dissecting the whole thing posteriorly. And advantage is this can also be performed in presence of an implant. So it does not restrict us, or it does not make us remove the implants and then do the surgery, but it can be done in presence of the implants. So these are small examples of how these surgeries were done. This was an inferiorly migrated L5-S1 disc herniation. After foraminotomy and removal of the ligamentum flavum, I can fish out this fragment completely here. You can see that the 3 millimeter rounger is able to gradually fish out this herniation. And once the herniation is completely out, you can grab it with your rounger and get it out. Now, we need to know that the patient is completely awake and aware. So we are really not worried about the neurological structures, but as the patient is going to report inadvertent pain. So that's a great advantage. And once you have herniation is completely removed, you can caudally and cranially check the whole area for any remnant fragments. The advantage is that since we have an endoscope which is not 0 degrees but 30 degrees, your field of vision is much more than the size of the endoscope. So you can practically see cranial, caudal, dorsal, and ventral if required. Removal of the bone can be done with a lot of tools. One is a reamer, which I showed you. Second is you can have trephines, which is a cannulated kind of an instrument with teeth. You can use powered instruments like this. You can use lasers, and you can use mechanical tools like osteotomes to take off as much as bone required. Now, the sleeve of the endoscope protects the neurological structures when you're taking off this bone. So bone removal can be done very safely, even in tight areas of the spine. Laser is a very valuable tool in especially stenosis. The laser ablates the tissue very brilliantly. And it's a fantastic tool when you're really operating in tight spaces. The post-operatively, the patients after laser, the use of the laser usually do not have pain because there is no residue for inflammatory process to set in. So laser works very good. We have to be careful. Again, the patient is awake and aware, so that's the best chance that the patient is going to report some inadvertent pain in case the laser by chance fires on the neurological structures. Now, as far as the interlaminar axes are concerned, we have classical axis, which is interlaminar. These interlaminar scopes are smaller scopes, so you can get inside the interlaminar window by just slitting the ligamentum flavum, not trying to open it. In case you have a concomitant lateral recess stenosis, which is primarily soft tissue, which is because of the ligamentum flavum, you can do a partial flavectomy in that area. But by and large, no great bone removal is required at L5-S1, sometimes at L4-5, some amount of bone has to be taken off to enlarge the interlaminar window. So you have a classical posterior interlaminar axis. Similarly, you can have an interlaminar axis over the top and on the contralateral side. Advantages is this can be performed under local anesthesia. The problem is if it's an extruded herniation, it's pretty easy to perform it under local anesthesia. But if you have to retract the neurological structures, then it's not very comfortable to the patient. So we prefer doing this under regional anesthesia. So it's technically easy because we are used to this kind of anatomy, seeing the thecal sac and everything from the posterior aspect. We are quite used to it. So the learning curve is pretty short. Second is shorter duration times. Now a standard L5-S1 discectomy, which is a straightforward discectomy at the level of the disc, doesn't take more than 20-25 minutes. So that's the kind of time that you're looking at. The incision that is taken is not more than 8 millimeters. So minimum to no laminotomy is required. Less than 3 millimeters of opening the ligamentum flavum because it's an elastic structure. So even if you make a small slit in the ligamentum flavum, this can be stretched out to get an access into the epidural space. Can address concomitant unilateral or bilateral stenosis if it is there. You can address all kinds of herniation which are far, near, and dorsal migrated herniation. Removal of herniations from the axilla, through the axilla or underneath the axilla, both are possible. Annuloplasty, limited annuloplasty in the area, ipsilaterally is possible. Contralaterally becomes a little more difficult, but by and large you can do it. Osteophytes, which are primarily end plate osteophytes or osteophytes at the base of the pedicle, can be removed comfortably without any problem. With interlaminar access, getting inside the foramen and to the extraforamen becomes extremely difficult. So sometimes when you have a multifocal herniations, you may have to choose both the procedures, the interlaminar and the transforaminal access. Again, even in presence of an implant, this can be performed. That's not a problem. So your movement may be restricted because of the implants, but by and large, you'll be able to perform the surgery well. So this is a short video of this interlaminar access. It's a kind of a discectomy, a small slit in the ligamentum flavum, a little bit of a ligamental flavum opening, and then you can primarily stretch. Now this is an anatomy which is like very well known to us. So you have to just get lateral to the neurological structures and mobilize the root. So once you mobilize the root, the herniation by and large comes out if it's an extruded herniation. And then you can use the tang of your sleeve to just squeeze it out and retract the neurological structures. So a pretty clean and a decent job can be performed without causing too much of inadvertent bilateral, collateral injury to the lamina, to the paraspinal musculature, to the ligamentum flavum. So all small bits of the herniation, even if it is multi-fragmented herniation, can be removed until complete decompression is achieved. So here you are seeing the last piece of herniation, which was a bit caudally migrated, which we got it out. So some inflammatory process, you do have some amount of bleeding, but then once you have completed the job, the extruded fragment is removed, you can have a judgment, or you have your own decision of whether you want to get inside the disc or not, depending upon how large is the annular fissure and how chronic and how long standing it is. So you can practically go underneath till the midline and see underneath because of the 30 degree, 20 degree, 25 degree optics of the endoscope. So by and large, you'll be able to do a good job here and achieving a complete decompression. Now, when you are trying to do endoscopic decompression of stenosis, we need to understand the basic philosophy that what is an access system and how much is, and what you're able to do with it. So these are the two pictures which you see, one here and one here. So what an interlaminar or a translaminar endoscopic decompression is extent you can do it. You can do a very good contralateral decompression, but ipsilateral is restricted to lateral recess, whereas transforaminal, extraforaminal, foraminal, and part of the lateral recess, you can do it. So entirely depends upon how the pathology is, whether it is predominantly ventral, whether it is predominantly dorsal, or a combined ventral and dorsal, whether the patient has a unilateral pain or a patient has a bilateral pain. So a lot of factors decide or tell us what kind of a surgery needs to be performed. So this is a kind of a transforaminal decompression of stenosis when you have a stenosis extending more caudally and the patient has predominantly unilateral symptoms. So you do a primary foraminotomy to get inside. So this is a different kind of a foraminotomy where you do an oblique foraminotomy, some from cranial to caudal, from lateral to medial. So the intention of doing this foraminotomy is not only taking off the part of the overhanging part of the superior articular process, but also to go more medial to the pedicle, at least till 50% of the half of the caudal pedicle, so that you reach that area, which is the target area, if the patient has unilateral stenosis. Now, the same job can also be done if it is a pure lateral recess through the interlaminar route. But if you are looking into foramen and the lateral recess both, then probably a single procedure would suffice. Now, once you have taken off part of the, you directly see the root here. Now, as you go more and more cranially, you see more and more overhanging of this ligamentum flavum in the axilla and over the roof of the axilla. The pathognomic feature of stenosis in most of these patients. So that can be ablated with a laser to completely decompress the axilla. I'm not taking too much time, so limited here. So once you have completed your decompression, you see the nice fluttering of the root in the lateral recess. You can see more caudal. since your drills have gone more 50% of the caudal pedicle, you already done partial pediculotomy. You can confirm the amount of decompression by putting in a 2.5 or a 3 millimeter blunt probe, which tells us a normal lateral recess would be more than 4 millimeters. So if you are able to put in this kind of an instrument, you know that you already created sufficient amount of space. Now, interlaminar decompression of stenosis, where you have a bilateral decompression to be done. So an extent of decompression normally is from the tip of the superior articular process to the half of the caudal pedicle. Now, this is, we know from the studies that the cadaveric studies and various kinds of studies that have been done, and which tells us where is the pathology in most of these cases of stenosis. So this is the extent of decompression. Now, the extent of decompression is in interlaminar surgery is completely guided by the image intensifier view, which tells us how far cranially we are in the interlaminar space and how far caudally we are. So we complete the interlaminar, because sometimes it becomes extremely difficult because the patient is in a prone position. So you may not actually see a lot of compression, which is there. So in lateral position is better to see that. So you do a phlebectomy once you have done the bone drilling. So I normally prefer to do a bone decompression before I do a soft tissue decompression. And then I can follow it up with a soft tissue decompression on the ipsilateral side. Fine sculpting of bone, if required, can be done any point of time. If you think that there is some amount of bone still there, you can do it. But by and large, to finish off bone is much more safer and easier and faster also, because it bleeds less before, out of the ligamentum before you get inside the ligamentum flavum. So it makes it job easy. So you have to go in more caudal. As I said, that half of the caudal pedicle is the target that we are looking, and you're going to see the entire area. So this is lateral to the neurological structure here. This is the root which is going to get exited. So it's a traversing root here, which will exit at the level below. This is going to be the axilla here, which you're going to see in a couple of seconds here. You'll see the axilla here. So you can explore the axilla. You can see the part of the disc there. So mobilization of the root is absolutely important, because there can be adhesions because of chronic ischemic pathology. So once you have mobilized the roots well, you have explored the axilla and your extent of decompression, now you are ready to go more contralateral. So you can take off more and more. So the best thing is to detach the ligamentum flavum from the lamina on the contralateral side, and first drill the base of the spinous process and then go contralaterally to take off more. I'm just fast forwarding it so that we will be able to finish it. So then fine sculpting on the contralateral side, all the small bits and pieces of ligamentum flavum and bone, if required, can be drilled using a different kind of a drill, which is more of an eccentric drill. So you're using a drill to take off more bone here. So all those fine areas need to be sculpted so that the entire neurological structures are cleared. Now, once you have completed with the decompression, which is more dorsal kind of a decompression, we have to concentrate on ventral decompression. So retracting the thecal sac on one side and looking into the floor of the spinal canal. So you can have osteophytes, you can have some annular bulges. All these things need to be burred out, taken out, and an annuloplasty performed. That is, you have to apply radio frequency energy to shrink all this collagen so that it flattens out. So a thorough ventral decompression is as necessary, much necessary in a case of stenosis as we do a dorsal decompression. So once we have completed with the ventral decompression, a complete decompressed thecal sac can be visualized with both the roots coming out and the extent of the decompression completed. So this is a brief overview of interlaminar decompression, or what we call it as a PSLD, posterior stenoscopic lumbar decompression, which uses a larger endoscope. So what to choose and when? What to choose and when is dependent again upon whether the problem is central, lateral, or foraminal, whether it is predominantly dorsal, predominantly ventral, or a combined. So a combination of procedures may have to be used with a transforaminal axis and an interlaminar axis, and with their modifications, if required, to deal with the pathology wherever it is. So Interbody fusions, yeah, this is a new addition to the entire endoscopic family. So though our experience has not been more than 25, 30 cases now, but by and large, we've been doing it and quite pretty happy with whatever outcomes and the procedure timings and patient outcomes are concerned. So we have the endoscopic assisted TLIF, then we have PLIF, which is PLIF, and third is OLIF. So OLIF we are not doing as on today, but and TLIF and PLIF is being regularly done. So this is a representative case with a grade 1 to 2 spondylolisthesis here. Now, this was a 70 years old man with a lot of comorbid conditions. So no chance that we could do anything other than endoscopy. So this was a transforaminal lumbar interbody fusion. Though the pedicle screws, for the pedicle screws, we had to give him a epidural analgesia so that it was more comfortable. And his CT scan at the end of 4 months showed formation of trabecular bone in between the interbody spaces. So we first initially thought that probably the pedicle screws will fail because it's holding on too much of stress. Now, initially, when we started with this kind of a technique, we were using single bullet cages. So we had limitation of the size. So we were not able to put cage sizes more than 10 millimeters. But now with expandable interbody cages, we are able to again jack it up to about 12 millimeters and start with about 8 millimeters and jack it up to 12 millimeters. So that was an interbody which was a TLIF, and this was a PLIF, the posterior. So we do a posterior decompression first, and then in a similar way, you can do a posterior interbody fusion, augmenting it with pedicle screws. Now, by and large, when you're doing an interlaminar surgery, since you take off the inferior articular process, you can use the same amount of same bone as graft. But for transforaminal surgery, this graft is not available. So the graft is harvested from the posterior superior iliac spine under local anesthesia. So this is also again a 6 to 7 millimeter incision, a small incision, and then you directly go into the iliac crest and harvest as much bone possible. Now, these are some representative examples that I have put in here. So this was a superiorly migrated herniation. You can see the herniation here in all the cuts. So we did this procedure transforaminal. So for L5S1 transforaminals is a little difficult because of the iliac crest, but we have developed over a period of time doing transiliac foraminoplastic decompressions, which are pretty easy, though it looks horrifying that we are going through the iliac crest, through the facet and directly into the axilla. But it's a pretty easy, and the patient is awake and aware. So again, that helps us. That's to our advantage, that the patient can report inadvertent pain. Now, this was his MRI after 1 year when he came along with his friend. This is a second case, which is a central herniation, bilateral, extending bilaterally, paracentrally, and inferior migrated. So this was a pretty large herniation, and we again chose to take this off transforaminally, and this is maybe after, I think, 1 year or 2 years, something like that. So this is the kind of outcome, though there is some amount of residual still remaining in the caudal part. Actually is not causing any problems, and now the MR myelogram also looks pretty normal. This is a foraminal lateral recess stenosis. So for this lateral stenosis, we did a transforaminal surgery. So mostly soft tissue stenosis. So we did a transforaminal surgery, and you can see here the part of the superior articular process at the level of the disc and above is gone. You see the same amount of SAP, part of the SAP which is gone. You see good amount of decompression as compared to the opposite side. The amount of decompression is very good in the foramen and in the lateral recess here. This is a third case which I'm showing, which is an osteophyte, which is a bone. You can see the kind of osteophyte here is a large osteophyte, end plate osteophyte. This was causing more stenotic symptoms, so we had to do a surgery. So we decided to do, since the symptoms were unilateral, we decided to do a transforaminal surgery, and we chopped off this whole osteophyte from the vertebral body completely to decompress the whole lateral recess in the foramen. You can see the part of the superior articular process also sacrificed here for decompression. And this was the axial at the end. You see some amount of bone still here, on the contralateral side, but he had no symptoms on the contralateral side. So we didn't bother to go on the contralateral side and do it. This is one more case, a chronic kind of a disc herniation which was seen, but we suspected a bone there because this was pretty long standing, and this was a central bilateral paracentral, but predominantly on the right side, multifocal herniation. So when we got a CT scan done, we could see a large calcified or ossified annulus there and a small disc herniation which had come out, which was causing the exacerbation of symptoms. So we did a transforaminal surgery here, and we scooped out the part of the osteophyte and the vertebral end plate and the vertebral body from the ventral surface to create more decompression. So this was the osteophyte that we took off completely here from the vertebral body. You can see two different sections here, completely taken off. Patient pretty much did pretty well after the procedure. So the learning curve for endoscopic surgery, either be it transforaminal or interlaminar, it's steeper, but I would say rather than steeper, it is more longer. It takes more. We try to do 1 or 2 cases and then we are not happy with it, and then we shift back to our conventional surgery. But persistently, if we hang on and continue to do it, and with the help of somebody or a mentor who is there, who is able to guide you during the surgery, then it can be easily mastered. The point is, how do you identify this anatomy and how do you navigate in these areas? Either it is a foraminal area or it's an interlaminar. It will give you, it will teach you everything. So this was a study done by Morgenstern from Spain, who says about 75 to 100 cases are required for a 90% success rates. So initial cases are going to be more challenging. So choosing simple cases in the beginning, operating with the help of a mentor, attending more and more workshops is definitely going to help and lessen the learning curve for endoscopic surgery. Thanks a lot for a patient listening.
Thank you, Dr. Girish. That was a fantastic, wonderful presentation, and you made it look so easy. So now I think we'll just go to the panelists for their opinions on the first talk, that is the pediatric hydrocephalus. I'd request Dr. T.N. Rao to give his comments regarding the pediatric hydrocephalus.
Good evening to everybody. Dr. Subodh presented excellently and lucid in talk. I had some doubts regarding the basically endoscope success rate depend upon the absorption of the arachnoid granulations, CS absorption in the arachnoid granulations. How do you assess the preoperatively the absorption capacity of the arachnoid granulations preoperatively?
Subodh, you have to unmute yourself.
Preoperatively in children, we cannot assess it. Based on the etiology, we tell that yes, in these cases, the arachnoid granulations may not be well, like a subarachnoid hemorrhage or intraventricular hemorrhage leading to subarachnoid hemorrhage, or a bad post-infective cases. Yes, in post-tubercular meningitis cases, we always get a contrast MRI done. If the contrast MRI is showing enhancing exudates, then we avoid doing an endoscopic third ventriculostomy. But a post-tubercular meningitis MRI not showing enhancing exudates is a good indication for doing an endoscopic third ventriculostomy. People have used contrast medium dyes and these things, but none of them have been they have stood the test of the time to know exactly how much arachnoid granulation is required for absorption of CSS, and what percentage is functioning in these cases.
You come to the TBM with hydrocephalus. You not mentioned in what talk about what are the indications in TBM, acute phase or chronic phase. What are the indication for ideal case to do the ETB? Because TBM associated with shunt have a lot of complications.
As I told you, TBM with hydrocephalus, if it has enhancing exudate, then avoid doing a endoscopic third ventriculostomy. Do a VP shunt only. But if there is no enhancing exudates on the MRI or these things, you can go ahead and do an endoscopic third ventriculostomy.
Is there any role of placing of the reservoir based on perioperative findings or post-operatively serial LP is done? You have any idea about the use on that?
In cases where I find that the opening pressure has been very high, in children especially, opening pressure is very high, or there is some abnormality in the anatomy where I'm not sure whether third ventriculostomy will work or not, then I place a reservoir. Initial days I used to do it in every cases, but now with time I have started using selectively the reservoirs actually.
Okay, Dr. Sukumar, do you have any comments on the first presentation? Dr. Sukumar, yeah.
Good presentation, Subodh. So just have few questions which will help the audience and especially the beginners. What is the temperature of the irrigation fluid you use normally? So what should be the temperature? Second thing, what is the ideal fluid you use regularly?
For all practical purpose, we exactly don't know it, but before the bottle is connected, touch it to your cheek. Okay. If you're comfortable, then go ahead and use that irrigation fluid. Number 1 point. And standardly, we use ringer lactate only. Okay. But nowadays, Serofondin has come. In some cases, used it, but it's okay. If it's a short procedure, you hardly use any irrigation. You don't require to spend money on Serofondin. You can just connect ringer lactate and leave it.
Okay. Good presentation, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Sukumar. Now, Dr. T.M. Rao, you have any comments on the second presentation to Dr. Girish Datta?
For second presentation, I don't have much experience. Sukumar can comment on that second presentation.
Yeah, Sukumar, I think you should.
Good presentation, Girish. So wonderful presentation. You covered almost everything. It's you started with transforaminal technique, ending with endoscopic fusion. So again, the question to you is: most of the people ask you the irrigation you are using. Normally, we use normal saline. Whether to use a pump or you use a gravitational force. If you use a pump, what is the ideal pressure you use normally?
Yeah, for transforaminal surgery, I haven't normally required the use. I mean, you don't require the pump as such because there's no much bleeding. So you can get away with the gravity-assisted irrigation. Now, the irrigation that you use, there are two kinds. One is an open system or it's a closed system irrigation. Open system irrigation is you connect something to the bottle if you have it, which is normally a 3-liter bottle of normal saline, and you can pump it and create more pressure inside. So this is a kind of a system, but then you are exposing yourself and you are exposing the patient to probably infection, but we have never found any of these patients. The second possibility is that if you're using a bag, so you can use a pump outside where you can control the amount of pressure that is generated. But by and large, for transforaminal surgery, you can use a gravity-assisted system that is sufficient. For interlaminar surgery, if it is a discectomy, again, a gravity-assisted system is fine because there is no much removal of bone or there is no much dissection involved. So usually it is not a problem. But for stenosis surgery, the moment you open up the ligamentum flavum and you try and go on the contralateral side, there is sometimes a chance that you have some excessive venous ooze because of decompression itself. And then you may need a pump. And the amount of pressure normally depends upon how much is the bleeding and how well you are able to control. So I normally start at about 30 millimeters of mercury. That is the starting. By and large, I have found that is sufficient. But sometimes you may have to go up to 60 millimeters of mercury for a very transient time and then immediately come down less than 45 because the opening pressure for the epidural space is about 45. Now, a couple of things as far as, I mean, I will add to this whole thing that I have said that a couple of things need to be remembered that we need to know that there is a chance that this can seep into the epidural space. So there are potential problems and there are some symptoms that the patient will start telling you. The first symptom that he tells is the neck pain. So if you try changing the position of his head from one side to another side, if he's comfortable, well, good enough. But if he's not comfortable, understand that this is not because of the position of the head, but it is probably because of. So I had that a patient also threw a seizure during the procedure, which was more like an absent seizure. We didn't come to know why, but when we saw it post-operatively later on, when we reviewed the video, there was some amount of bleeding and the pressure that was a little more, and we kept it for a longer time. So I personally feel that only for stenosis surgery, you may need a pump, majoritarily at 30 millimeters of mercury. Very transiently, you can rise it above 45, but come down immediately less than 45. So that's safer. I hope I have answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. And one of our friend wants to add to this fluid issue. So the question is, can we add some antibiotic to the irrigation fluid?
Yeah, for transforaminal surgery, it would be useful because you're for primarily intradiscal. So that would be useful, and the amount of fluid irrigation required is also very less, because you are able to finish most of the transforaminal surgery very fast if it is a discectomy less than half an hour. For interlaminar surgeries, I have never found it to be really useful because the amount of fluid sometimes exceeds. You may sometimes go up to 6 liters, 9 liters also. So I don't think it would be useful for interlaminar. For but transforaminal, yes, definitely yes.
Yeah, I agree with you. So most of the time, commonly we don't use any antibiotics, but I agree with you for transforaminal, yes, we can use it. And how much it is useful, we don't know, but still we can use it. So coming to one more last question regarding the foraminoplasty, what is your advocacy whether doing foraminoplasty blindly before entering the disc, you do a foraminoplasty with your tools, or you do an endoscopic visualized foraminoplasty? What do you advise for the beginners?
You mean foraminoplasty or foraminotomy?
Foraminoplasty, like say you want to do foraminoplasty after entering the disc, then coming out and doing a foraminoplasty after the disc removal, or you do a foraminoplasty first and then see the roots and enter the disc and remove the fragment. What is your experience?
See, I always start, if I have to do a foraminoplasty, I first start with a foraminotomy, always. So I first make a small access through the superior articular process. By and large, if I'm doing it for disc herniation, a foraminotomy is sufficient. You go and pick up the herniation, come out. Now, foraminotomy, I prefer to do it blind, outside in. Because my patient is awake and aware. I'm not doing my surgery under GA or spinal. I'm doing 100% of my surgeries. Transforaminal, I do it under local anesthesia. Second most important thing is I'm going through the superior articular process. So the trajectory of my drill, which is going through the superior articular process, and the trajectory of the exiting route is completely opposite. It is coming from dorsal to ventral, the route, and my trajectory is going from dorsal to ventral in a exactly opposite direction. So safety parameters is absolutely no issue. The only issue comes is when you have a disc which is collapsed completely, you have a very narrow foramen. In that situation, probably I would put in the sleeve at the level of the disc, without level of the foramen, retract the nerve root with the sleeve, and then proceed ahead with the foramen.
Okay. And what is your experience of this post endoscopic fusion paresthesias with your limited experience?
Yeah, I have never encountered any post-operative dysesthesias after fusion surgery for two reasons. One is I do a really big and an extended foraminotomy. Extended foraminotomies, I take off practically the whole of superior articular process. So I do a large extended foraminoplasty. Second most important thing is, if I find that there is a lot of foraminal stenosis or a lateral recess stenosis, then I do not do my surgery with one single incision, because the trajectory for the cage placement is be perfectly at 45 degrees. Whereas for the decompression would be around 20 degrees. So from 20 degrees to 45 degrees, maneuvering the endoscope is not only painful to the patient, but it is very irritating because it also causes a lot of bleeding because of retraction of nearby soft tissues. So I use 2 incision, one for decompression, one for fixation. So I have never encountered any kind of dysesthesia with transforaminal extended. For interlaminar surgery, also I don't experience any kind of dysesthesia or transient problems, because again here I take off the whole inferior articular process. So once I take off the whole inferior articular process, I have sufficient amount of room. Plus we have some new designed sleeves, which are, we are always thought to have sleeves which are round, but now we have sleeves which are rectangular in shape. So we can maneuver this rectangular shape into the Camden's triangle, the broadest part of the Camden's triangle, gently retract the root and then go inside. Now, only my interlaminar surgeries or a PLIF, I do it with the patient under regional anesthesia, combined spinal and epidural. But all my transforaminal, TILIF, I do it under local, 100% local. Only epidural, we put in the catheter before we start, that is for the pedicle screws. Because sometimes when the pedicle screws are getting in, the patient has pain and we cannot stop. And we cannot give local in that area. Because the moment you inject local, it is going to be absorbed by the medullary bone. So the patient can have local anesthetic toxicity sometimes because you're putting in local, but nothing is working there. So all surgeries, since they are under local for transforaminal, never have a problem. Interlaminar, since we take off too much of bone, there is no problem.
Yeah. Thank you, Girish. So, to all our viewers, to conclude regarding endoscopic surgery, so there are so many things getting clear by the day by day. So now L4, L5, most of the time we can get away with transforaminal endoscopic surgery if there is no stenosis. And L5S1, it's a choice. If iliac bone is low, so we can do transforaminal, or you can, window is bigger, you can go interlaminar. And for stenosis, so it's up to the experience of the surgeon for the lateral recess, whether to go transforaminal or interlaminar. Central stenosis, there is no doubt we need to go interlaminar. And foraminal, extraforaminal, definitely yes, transforaminal is the route, as Datar clearly mentioned and showed the videos. So there are so many areas where things are getting more and more day by day. We are getting clear that endoscopy has a greater role, including fusion. So I think in future maybe we have a good replacement technique for all our minimal invasive techniques. Thank you, Girish. Thank you once again.
Thanks a lot, Sukumar.
Thank you, Sukumar. Just there are a couple of questions for Dr. Subodh from Dr. Sai Sudarshan. Is there any particular definite imaging to know that the stoma is patent?
Yeah, we do the phase contrast CSF flow studies we do. And you calculate the stroke volume across the aqueduct and if you have done aqueductoplasty or through the ventriculostomy stoma to know the flow of the CSF.
Dr. Raghavendra wants to know the indications for ETB in shunt failed patients. Any tips on MRI findings?
We have to study the MRI. First of all, the basic thing we have to know is whether the ventricles are dilated or not. Number 1 point. Number 2, third ventricle is adequately dilated. Foramen of Monro is adequately dilated. The thickness of the floor of the third ventricle and the prepontine cistern has to be seen, and always get a contrast MRI in these cases to know for any exudates, enhancing exudates, or there is if there is a significant, as I told before also, significant enhancing exudates, don't do a third ventriculostomy, and that's all.
Yeah, another question.
And last question from Subodh to Subodh.
Yeah.
Last question, like every case, do you favor placing a reservoir for all endoscopic third ventriculostomy cases?
My initial, maybe initial 200 cases, I did that. Okay. But now, as I told you, on table, if I find the opening pressure to be very high, small child, in number of cases, we have seen that the third ventriculostomy, you have made an opening in the third ventriculostomy. The functioning of the flow of CSF takes some time actually. To prevent the initial CSF leak through the wound and to manage the initial CSF pressure, we do a controlled tapping through the reservoir. So if opening pressure is high, and if we are not satisfied with a third ventriculostomy or the anatomy is distorted, we are not sure. In those cases, nowadays I put a reservoir. Otherwise, I don't put it. Avoid straight cut cases of acute stenosis and these things I don't put it.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Subodh, I will just pose a problem to you.
Yes.
Just an infant with hydrocephalus, you have done ETV,
Hmm.
and we check the flow. The ETV is working well, and you have a reservoir, and he has got a CSF leak.
Mhm.
What is your procedure of choice, EVD or go for a shunt?
If by tapping of the reservoir frequently it is not coming down, the first thing you have to check in these cases is a formation of subdural hygroma. The leak happens from the subdural hygroma, not the ventricular CSF actually. So if there is no subdural hygroma, please don't wait too much. You may land up in an infection. Straight away go and put a shunt if it is not being managed by reservoir tapping.
Now, what is your experience of CSF leak when you were putting reservoir after ETV and when you were not putting reservoir after ETV? Was there any difference in the incidence of CSF leak?
There is no difference in the incidence because, as I told you, the sole purpose of putting a reservoir is to do a control tapping, especially in infants actually, where the frontal is open, and the parents and the referring pediatrician can also know whether CSF is under high pressure or the frontal is bulging. So a number of pediatricians whom I have interacted with, they know how to tap a reservoir actually. They don't have to come to me to get that reservoir tapped. So the CSF leak incidence was very low in that. But yes, I had CSF leak with wound healing issues in small children because the skin is very thin, friable, and by putting a reservoir, you have created a fistula type of thing.
And reservoir itself will cause the healing issues.
Absolutely. So that's why I'm telling, over a period of time, we have become more rational in putting reservoir. We are not putting reservoir in every case.
Okay, what is your take on doing ETV and the shunt simultaneously in the same sitting?
I have not done that, but in case,
for infants.
no. In none of the cases I have done both the procedure. Yes, if the child has a shunt and I have to, shunt is malfunctioning, not an absolute blockage, I have left the shunt like that and done an ETV. But I have not done a dual procedure anytime.
We have been facing a problem when we did the ETV for infants, like ended up with reservoir replacement, with CSF leak, with healing issues. Then we started practicing ETV plus shunt for quite some time, and we were quite comfortable with that.
So why
Ramakrishna?
Why ETV is required in these cases?
No, actually, it is like this. Say there is some lower socioeconomic patient whom you do a ETV, and probably patient is a gross hydrocephalus, where you expect there will be some amount of CSF leak, and ETV will not be enough to cater to the hydrocephalus. Then what we have been doing is put both, so that at least hope that one works, and even if the patient is at a far off place, he should not have any major issues. That is what. But let me tell you very clearly that probably there is no clear-cut scientific explanation for doing that, apart from saying that the patient is a likely candidate that he may not come back or he may not be under regular follow-up.
Because always remember, if the CSF doesn't flow through the ETV, ventriculostomy is going to get closed. Where any opening to remain patent, it has to flow.
Where for complex hydrocephalus, would advise both ETV and shunt.
Septostomy with shunt. Complex hydrocephalus, you have to do multiple septostomies and shunt.
And the author Wood has done both, but success rate is better compared with the only single procedure.
Maybe.
Another thing I have doubt, one question to you, Subodh, for academy. The both failed ETV and shunt, repeated shunt revisions and ETV. Then what? There you can consider of the CPC?
Yes. I have started doing, especially in post, as I told you, post meningomyelocele hydrocephalus are sometimes bad, and if the shunt fails in them, ETV also doesn't work in these cases. So in these cases, I go for an extensive choroid plexus coagulation, or in cases where there has been repeated shunt failures, ETV has been done, I go for extensive choroid plexus coagulation.
Actually, we also have some experience in doing intraventricular thulium laser coagulation. But always that fear is there that if there is a vein or something which you can perforate, you are in big trouble with the laser. So
the advantage of thulium is it's a non-contact laser, number 1 point, and the tissue penetration is 0.01 mm, 0.01. Yes, inadvertently if you touch the vein, yes, the bleeding is an issue. You have to be careful, but your work gets done faster than compared to a bipolar cautery for CPC.
Suppose for CPC need flexible or rigid endoscope?
If you want to do a complete choroid plexus coagulation, flexible is must. Rigid, you can't do a complete.
There is no way you can do it. Only a limited quantity will be able to do.
Yes.
So you have to do 2 burrows, 2 side approach.
No, with a septostomy, you can go to the opposite side. You don't require to 2 burrows.
So, but that needs big, large ventricles, huh?
Parledu. I have never faced that issue because these are chronic problems with patients with big ventricles only.
I think all of these questions we can have over a cup of tea when we meet in future, hopefully, physically. And, I thank Dr. Subodh and Dr. Girish. Excellent presentations. I mean, they're real good videos and presentations. Dr. Girish has made, look, he is, I mean, we feel that after his lecture, we feel that it is a very simple procedure, but I'm sure, as you said, there is a very steep learning curve. So thank you, Dr. Girish. Thank you, Dr. Subodh. And I thank Dr. Narasimha and Dr. Sukumar for being the panelists. And
Thank you very much
for cooperating with this. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure being here.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Girish.
Thank you.
Bye.
Dr. Girish, I think in future also we'll be calling you for some this thing so that when you have a very excellent style of presentation. I really congratulate you on that, and your slides, everything is fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Girish.
Thank you, Ramakrishna, for giving opportunity.